Good afternoon and welcome to the Center for Disaster Philanthropy webinar, The Global Refugee Crisis, at our doors and beyond. Hi everybody, I'm Bob Ottenhoff and I'm the President and CEO of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. The global refugee crisis continues to make news and break records. More than 65 million people are currently displaced around the world, and the number is growing. An unprecedented 34,000 people on average, or roughly 24 people a minute, are now being displaced from their homes by conflict and violence every day. Understanding how to use philanthropic resources to address the global refugee crisis is incredibly challenging. And although this complex situation has been going on for years, the crisis is politically charged and constantly changing. In the United States, a legal battle over an executive order regarding the origin countries of refugees has begun, throwing into limbo many long-standing practices to resettle refugees. Meanwhile, the humanitarian assistance needs are continuing to mount on many fronts. Thanks for joining us today. We're joined in our discussion by a panel of individuals who have great expertise in many facets of the refugee crisis. Our discussion will feature Aryah Landsberger, the Director of Programs, Grantmakers Concerned with Immigrants and Refugees, and Richard, Visiting Fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Perry Worldhouse and Adjunct Professor at Georgetown University. He was previously the Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration. And Deborah Jacobs, President and CEO of the Patterson Foundation. Before we get started, a few bits of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded and we'll be making it available afterwards on both our site and others. You may submit a question at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to get to all of your questions by the end of the webinar. And now I'd like to turn to Stacy Frazier of the Council on Foundations, the co-sponsor of today's webinar, to welcome everyone. Stacy, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Bob. On behalf of the Council on Foundations, we are pleased to co-sponsor this webinar with our partner, the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. The Council's membership includes a broad national network of grant makers working with refugee communities, both here in the U.S. and globally. Over the last 18 months, we've partnered with CDP and our members on a number of conversations linked to this crisis, including our annual Global Philanthropy Dinner in 2016, which focused on the global refugee situation, featured speakers from the State Department, UNHCR, and the DC think tank community. Just last week, we held a conversation where CDP was a speaker to discuss how foundations within our membership have been impacted by the Trump administration executive orders on immigration and refugees, with several working on policy-related issues linked changing immigration regulations that also impact refugees. We look forward to hearing from today's speakers about how philanthropy can best play a role during the current refugee challenge globally, and are truly grateful to our continued partnership with CDP and our members around this critical issue. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. It's Stacy Frazier from the Council on Foundations. Let's turn now to our speakers. And Aryah, let's start with you. Aryah Landsberger, you're the Director of Programs for Grantmakers Concerned with Immigrants and Refugees. You deal with these crises every single day. Can you kind of set the stage for us? Many of our donors follow this, but it's hard to keep up the speed on all the various things going on. So maybe you could start by kind of setting the picture for us and let us know what the current situation is.
Thank you so much, Bob, and thank you to the Council on Foundations and the Center for Disaster Philanthropy for inviting us to this call and for hosting this really critical conversation. So I'd just like to take a moment before I discuss how we see philanthropy engaging on the refugee crisis, is to describe who we are, Grantmakers Concerned with Immigrants and Refugees. We are a philanthropy serving organization founded in 1990, and our mission is to inform, connect, and catalyze philanthropy to engage in effective grant making that's inclusive of immigrants and refugees, and really aims to increase the shared prosperity of our communities. And we do programming such as our monthly policy calls to keep funders up to date and conduct technical assistance, mappings, and field interviews. To date, we have nearly 100 members with a very recent uptick. And most recently, we issued a joint foundation statement on immigration that has 190 signatories, really unprecedented in our history. So we're very grateful for this moment of joint statements and foundation support for these issues. And so moving on to the topic at hand, I think I'd really, on my end, and our next speaker, Anne, is going to complement some of what I will be addressing, but I'd like to take a moment to really focus in on funder responses to refugees in the U.S. based on our work. And historically at GSER, we have seen a keen interest in, but perhaps more limited grant making to organizations working with resettled refugees in the U.S. And in the past several years, there's been a growing interest around learning about how our refugee resettlement system works and how refugees are being integrated into our communities. And right now, we're seeing a level of urgency that we have not seen before. So in addition to the focus on litigation around the executive order that was mentioned at the call, and I hope Anne can fill in some of those details around the executive order, we're really seeing an interest in and a need for more philanthropic engagement in two key buckets. So there's two key spaces that we're seeing. One is refugee integration in the United States, and the second is policy and advocacy. So I'm just going to take a moment to give a little bit more detail about these two buckets, and I'm happy to answer more questions about what we're seeing on the ground and in philanthropy. So with respect to refugee integration, we're really seeing an interest and an effort to strengthen the domestic systems to ensure that there's robust refugee integration outcomes inside the U.S. This can include support for language access, employment assistance, housing, development of leadership skills for refugees, access to legal resources. And we've even seen a very innovative refugee hackathon concept lifted up very recently. We're also seeing an interest in understanding the interconnectedness of refugee integration here in the U.S. with the global refugee resettlement system, particularly through the lens of family reunification. So due to the executive order that was issued just a while ago, we expect some updates soon, but we're still waiting for that. But as of now, refugees in the U.S. are waiting to see whether their family members who were supposed to be resettled will be able to come. And this is because about 70%, as I understand it, of the refugees that are waiting to be resettled are actually family reunification cases. So this includes spouses, children, parents of refugees who are here in the U.S. already. A resettlement agency shared with me the example of a young man from the Congo whose parents were killed and who was separated from his only sister during flight. And eventually they were able to identify that she was alive, and she was identified for resettlement back here to the U.S. However, she was scheduled to ride right after the executive order was issued, and she was stopped, which really for this young man was just utterly devastating. And really, it's very difficult to give words to that kind of pain. And with only about 15,000 spots left, if the executive order stands, that leaves a lot of refugees waiting abroad with the expectation that they were going to be reunified with family here. So a lot of concerns there. And the second bucket that I just want to briefly mention is policy and advocacy. We're really seeing an interest in philanthropy to build up the network of those that work on policy and advocacy in the refugee community, both at a national level and at a local level. At a local level, because we are still seeing state-level legislation that targets refugees, such as moratoriums or other acts that would make refugees feel unwelcome in the state. But we're also seeing some positive legislation on welcoming refugees. So there's a real opportunity, and there's been some effort to invest in refugees themselves as leaders in their communities, as movement builders, to respond to and connect with others, to really give voice to the refugee issues in their communities. So I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to the conversation afterwards. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. That's Aryah Summers Landsberger, and we'll bring her back in a few minutes. But right now we want to ask Ann Richard to say a few words. Ann, you were until just recently the Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration. So you were involved, deeply involved in all of these issues on a moment-by-moment basis. And I wonder if you could start by kind of giving us a perspective on the worldwide refugee crisis.
Sure. Thanks everyone for listening in. Thank you, Bob, for the introduction. In the past 5 years, I had that position, and it gave me a good vantage point to see the global situation. I want to talk very briefly about the aid the U.S. Government provides overseas and the partners with which the U.S. government chooses to work. Maybe just touch on resettlement and diplomacy before moving to the next speaker. If you ask in terms of aid overseas, the who, what, and where of what the government does to help, the who is this bureau in the State Department getting $3.4 billion a year from Congress and providing it to the world's best humanitarian organizations. UNHCR, which is the UN Refugee Agency in Geneva, the International Organization for Migration, the International Committee on the Red Cross, and many very capable international non-governmental organizations. The what is shelter, medical care, including reproductive health care for women, supplies, the ordinary household supplies that people need to set up a home after they've fled. Much of that is emergency response in the early days of a crisis. But we don't just talk about aid, we also talk about protection. The need for people's legal rights to be known and to be observed, even if they have fled into exile and crossed an international border. In addition, there's a lot more conversation right now, realizing that refugees can stay in exile for years and years and years, that more must be done to help them not just survive the early days, but to thrive as the years go by. And so there's a much more of a focus these days on educating children so that they do receive an education and have some kind of opportunities in life, and then in promoting livelihoods or skills training for refugees so that they can earn a living in the places that they've fled to. In terms of resettlement of refugees, that's one of the solutions, so-called 3 durable solutions for refugees. The best durable solution is that they get to go home again, but unfortunately we haven't seen a lot of that in the last few years, as there's so many crises and they have evaded being resolved. And so the other solutions are that they be allowed to stay in the countries that they fled to, and the other is that they be resettled in a new country. So in addition to resettlement in the United States, there are other countries that sometimes take refugees, and one of the things the Obama administration tried to do was to lengthen that list of countries. In the US, as you probably heard, resettlement is carried out through a public-private partnership, and 9 national networks help to do that, and that all of them seek to get volunteers and to raise funds and to get contributions of household supplies and furniture to help the refugees in their early days in the United States. 6 of them are faith-based: HIAS, Episcopal Migration Ministries, Lutheran Immigrant and Refugee Services, World Relief, Church World Service, and the biggest is U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops. And then 3 are non-sectarian: International Rescue Committee, U.S. Committee on Refugees and Immigrants, and ECDC, which started as the Ethiopian Community Development Group. In addition to helping the refugees, many of them were involved in advocacy. And whether they're working to help refugees overseas or in the U.S., many are concerned about the President Trump's executive order that right now is under a stay from the 9th District Court on the West Coast. But if I understand it's going to be a revised version will be released in the coming days. What the original executive order did was pause the resettlement of refugees for 120 days, prohibit anyone coming from Syria, which is particularly distressing because that is the largest refugee crisis in the world. Make a priority for those fleeing religious persecution, but really it was written in a way that it was focused on helping Christians above all other faithful, and limit the number coming in to 50,000 a year instead of 110,000, which had been the plan that the Obama administration had left. 110,000 was a very ambitious target, but 50,000 is more than half of what had been planned. I forgot to tell you where the refugees are coming from. It's important to realize it's not just Syria. Syria certainly has produced the most refugees on earth, but this is a global problem. We see refugees fleeing crises in West and East Africa, in Southeast Asia, and elsewhere in the Middle East. So it's a problem that requires all hands on deck. If the U.S. government is giving so much funding, why would private sector and philanthropists have to get involved? The reason is the scale of what's happening now is just so overwhelming that we need to tap new sources of funds in order to do everything that ought to be done. We're seeing that the UN's appeals for funding are only covered by, to the point of 30 or 50%, which leaves a lot of things, a lot of needs unmet. And we're particularly concerned about neglected crises that aren't in the newspaper every day. People in Chad and Cameroon who fled Boko Haram, or people displaced in the Central African Republic. Refugees in camps in Kenya have been there a long time. South Sudanese who fled into Uganda. Unfortunately, the list just goes on. And I so appreciate being invited to be part of this phone call. Thank you.
Thank you. That was Ann Richard. She's previously the Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration. And we'll bring Ann back into the conversation again in a moment. But now we want to go on to Deborah Jacobs. Debra is the President and CEO of the Patterson Foundation, based in Sarasota, Florida. And Debra, the Patterson Foundation recently made a contribution to CDP's Refugee Crisis Fund. And I wondered if you would talk a little bit about why you did that, what motivated you, and what you can say to other donors who may be considering involved in the refugee issues.
Thanks, Bob, and thanks, everyone. Very impressive speakers I'm following there. I always talk in the world of some people are wizards and some people are muggles. I'm putting on my muggle hat right now because I'm following wizards. But let me share a little bit. The Patterson Foundation is a fully endowed charitable foundation. We're place-based in Sarasota County, working in our local region. But we're also well aware that we are we are a citizen of the globe. And we know that disasters happen around the globe. We have intentionally chosen to work with CDP, Center for Disaster Philanthropy, because we are by far not experts, and we really believe in the mission of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy in terms of improving the effectiveness of when philanthropy wants to make a difference, but it may not be the donor or the foundation's core thinking about how to live and work in the disaster space. So whether it's a Mother Nature disaster or a human caused disaster, having an entity like CDP is invaluable for anyone interested in making a difference, because so often people do it in the immediate response, but yet when a disaster is among us, it's the relief, it's the recovery, it's the rebuild, it's the resilience. And you heard previous speakers talk about this. So when we think about the role of philanthropy with all of the governmental support, mega humanitarian serving organizations, CDP can, through its advisory boards for whichever disaster it is, and today we're all about the global refugee issue, they put together an A+ advisory group to say, okay, where's the niche? How can we make a difference? The Patterson Foundation, actually, for the Syrian refugee crisis, has contributed, with our most recent contribution, over $500,000 to that. To some, that may sound like a lot of money. It is serious money. But in the world of the global refugee crisis, it's literally smaller than a teardrop. And I use the teardrop because it's a sad situation. When Bob says to us there are 65 million forcibly displaced people, that is the size of Florida and Texas. Think about every human being in those two states who is now living out of a suitcase or out of a either their suitcase or their, I think I just went off. I hope you can still hear me.
Yes, we can. Yes.
Okay, good. Either living out of a garbage bag or a suitcase. Maybe they have a language barrier, and then we get to the children. When 50% of those who have been forcibly displaced are children, let's take that 65 million. Now I'm going to talk about how many states the children component is. That's the combination of New York and Pennsylvania. I think anyone with a philanthropic bone in their body, knowing the facts, would say, I've got to do something, and I want to do it effectively. And that is, in fact, why we have chosen to work with CDP, because of the expertise Bob brings together and helps focusing, realizing we are but a teardrop in this whole stream. I can go on, but Bob, I think that's a good enough summary.
Okay. Hey, Deborah, thank you so much. And thank you for your participation both today and with the Refugee Fund. And we'll come back to you in a few minutes to talk some more.
Okay.
To some of our donors. I want to go back to Aryah and Ann and address this issue that Deborah brought up in her comments, that this is just the contributions so far from the philanthropic sector are but a teardrop in what's needed. And a common response we hear from donors is that this is so big and so complicated that it needs to be taken care of by government at all levels. And I wonder if you both would address that issue. Excuse me, Aryah, if you could go first.
Great, thanks so much. So, I think I do understand that response and that concern about the complexity and that it's so big. But I think that we're in a moment where we have seen really effective public-private partnerships across different sectors. We've seen it in education and health, really having positive impacts in our communities. So I think that that is the case, but we have found ways to tackle some of those issues. And I think collaborative funds are a way to do that. Funder learning collaboratives, we've seen a lot of peer engagement around this issue of trying to help each other learn and coming up with some common strategies. So I think that's a way that it starts to feel less overwhelming to partner with other funders to learn, collaborate, and possibly do grant making together if that's an interest. So we've seen that as a way to tackle this. And I think really looking at your foundation priorities, what are your core priorities? and how can you be inclusive of refugees in your core priorities? And I think there are many ways to do it. I think Deborah did a beautiful job of explaining how that is consistent with the Patterson Foundation's priorities. And I think, when we use a diversity, equity, inclusion lens in our grant making, when we look at different ways to see our communities, really understand our communities, we will see that there are ways to be inclusive of refugees, and it doesn't feel as challenging, difficult, or complex, but really part of what we're doing already. So I see that as I see as many opportunities, really, even though it does feel that way.
And what would you say to donors who may be listening today about just the overwhelming both size and complexity of this issue? Can donors really make a difference?
Well, I agree that it is a very large and multifaceted crisis. Before we left office, we were trying to get more governments to contribute and the traditional donors to give more. And unfortunately, we were only having a mixed record in accomplishing that. And President Trump, I know, is talking about cutting foreign aid, which would also mean then cutting humanitarian and development budget accounts. So the U.S. may end up doing less than it has, which is the wrong direction, given everything we've just discussed. So looking at additional sources of funding, I guess I would tell potential funders, first, a little bit of money can do a great deal. It can be life-saving. When we're talking about things like clean water and vaccinations overseas, a little bit of money can make the difference between children surviving and dying. Secondly, I think that the organizations that are operational in the field, some of them are among the best in the world. There's been a real professionalization among international non-governmental organizations, US-based ones, and some of the others that are based overseas, where it's no longer just sort of well-intentioned people jumping on airplanes and heading out. There really is a great deal of thought that's put into living up to standards and operating in a way that takes advantage of the expertise, the smarts, the skills of local people, and less reliance on expatriates parachuting in. Third, a lot can be done and ought to be done for those crises that are still there when the cameras leave, when the journalists are gone. Syria has now been going on for nearly 6 years. Perhaps the public is getting tired of hearing about crises in the Middle East. And then I also mentioned some of the neglected crises in other parts of the world where people are just as deserving of help and can be tremendously resilient with just a little bit of help and attention and care. But they need that little bit. They need that little bit to make a difference in their lives. Thank you.
So let me remind all of our listeners that we're eager to take your questions as well. And if you do have a question, you can go to the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, type in your question, and press send. And we'll try to get to your questions just as soon as possible. And I have a follow-up question for you. When I think of the word refugee, I think of something that is temporary, that someone is rushing out of their home and their homeland into a temporary kind of situation. But for many of these refugees now, it's no longer just a short-term stay, but this could last for years and years, and it already has in many cases. Does that change the picture in terms of what we fund and how we fund it?
Yes, it does. that's why there's been a lot more attention on trying to ensure that children get into school or some kind of community-based learning situation while they're living in exile. Because if crises drag on for 15, 20, 25 years, that's a generation. And so that means children will grow up waiting for stability. And if they're told that they'll get to go to school when the crisis is over, they will never get to go to school. And they will not be able to learn at the point in their lives where they really need to be learning and stimulated and taken care of by teachers and educators. So that's a very key part of this, as well as other opportunities. One of the reasons there were so many people walking across Turkey and taking boats to Greece and walking across Europe from places like Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan was because they were looking for opportunities. They were looking for a chance to either finish their education or to have an education and get a job. And so this is a crying need to be able to help people who then will be fully capable of taking care of themselves. And I think most refugees really want to be able to do that, to become self-sufficient.
So we're starting to get some questions, and thank you very much. Aryah, let's start with you on this question from a reader, from a listener. Aryah mentioned the importance of policy, as did Anne. Are there implications and or limitations of the legal status of refugees from the 1951 convention, from the post-World War II Europe area, or is this adequate? So I guess what you first might do is just put in context the listeners here talking about certain policies that have been agreed on by the world. I'm not, our listeners may not be familiar precisely with the 1951 convention, but maybe you could talk in general about the policy implications. And when you're finished, Anne, I'd like you to talk about this as well.
Great, thank you. So, I think that the 1951 convention, and I'm sure Anne will have a lot to say about this as well, happened in a particular historical moment. And what we've seen since that time is really an evolution and understanding of how the convention can apply to changing context. And so, for example, we've seen the inclusion of gender and sexual-based violence as a basis for refugee status. And we've seen other categories. We've seen the LGBTQ community also be included within this understanding of what the convention was really about, the spirit of the convention in terms of protection. And, I think it's really, the implications, limitations are really depending in which country you're sitting in. In the US, it could depend which immigration court you're sitting in. And this was, as I said, agreed upon in a certain historical context in the post-World War II era. And I think, and I'll let Anne fill in some of the gaps that I skipped over quickly, but to sort of bring it into what we're seeing today play out in terms of policy and its impact in our communities here in the US. I mean, I think, the policy advocacy today has really, there's a real urgency right now, because I think for many years, policy and advocacy really focused around, are there adequate resources to support our refugee resettlement system here in the US? Are we being inclusive of those that are truly vulnerable? How is our refugee resettlement process working? Are people able to make through? Are they getting vetted properly? So policy was really focusing on process and elements and inclusion. And there were still some issues, in the broader concept or definition of the refugee. But I think policy really worked around that. what we're seeing right now at this moment from, what I understand from the refugee community is the sense that there is an effort right now to fundamentally shift the way that the U.S. policy has operated on refugees for decades, which is to welcome refugees into our community as part of our broader, national and foreign policy. And the concern is that this executive order that we referenced would not just be a pause, but would lead to a permanent stop to refugees. So when I talk about policy and advocacy, I'm really talking about the sense of urgency in our community, that there needs to be funding to help protect this policy of welcoming refugees the way that we have for many years.
Anne, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, the 1951 convention defined refugees as people who had crossed an international border and that they were fleeing persecution based on their race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or because they were being persecuted because of their political beliefs. And during the Cold War, we saw a lot of refugees coming from east to west who were educated, could sometimes speak more than one language. Many were European, and they were fleeing communism. They were looking to live in the West, and some of them were able to really fit into Western society and get jobs as at universities, as intellectuals, as scientists. We now bring people through resettlement programs who come from all socioeconomic backgrounds. And so some will be physicians or scientists from Iraq or Syria, but there also could be people who are illiterate from less developed countries. All refugees arriving in the U.S. are expected to get jobs. And so helping them get jobs is a key part of if they are able-bodied, they're expected to get a job and start supporting themselves as soon as 3 months after they arrive. And so this is a big appeal to private sector firms, that they help hire refugees and not just provide assistance to them, but really get them into the job market so that they can support themselves. We also make a premium on bringing some of the most vulnerable refugees. So in a family, there may be somebody who can work, but there could be someone else who has severe medical needs, someone who's been traumatized or a torture victim, or a child who has survived a bombing, for example. And as we make that a priority for the program, that means that families need some extra care and attention for these very challenging problems that some of them are bringing with them. We also, so we see people fleeing because of membership in social groups, as Aryah mentioned, LGBT, religious beliefs, political beliefs, but also just wholesale war and bombing. And now with some of the Central American children and families walking from the northern triangle of Central America, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, to the U.S. border, many of them are fleeing criminal gangs and drug traffickers. And that doesn't fit neatly into the 1951 convention that U.S. law is based on. And so we see immigration judges making, some do consider these cases to be refugee cases, some are ruling in a different direction, and that's somewhat controversial. But clearly these are people who are fleeing for their lives. And so that area is one that needs additional attention and help, I think.
You're listening to a webinar brought to you by the Center for Disaster Philanthropy and Council on Foundations. We're talking today about the global refugee crisis. We've got three experts with us on the line. Aryah Landsberger from the Grantmakers Concerned with Immigrants and Refugees, and Richard, a visiting fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Perry World House and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, and Deborah Jacobs, president and CEO of the Patterson Foundation. Deborah, I'd like to ask you another question that came to us from a participant, and this one has to do with just the large number of groups. How would you encourage organizations working with refugees, asylum work seekers, and displaced persons to make their work known to foundations interested in supporting this work? There are so many groups doing important work, and there are so many that some are more well-known than others. So how to present work to a foundation that can cut through the clutter?
Well, once again, we're very fortunate to have a national organization called the Foundation Center. So anyone could access the Foundation Center. The organizations can go on to the Foundation Center and do a search by what foundations do global refugee or immigrant or whatever the issue is. The challenge is that every foundation comes at it from their own way. So that is a journey to figure out which is the best, because a foundation basically is a donor. And Mrs. Got-a-lot thinks differently than Mr. Has-a-lot. So it's figuring out what is important to an individual donor, a corporate donor, or a foundation. So I would take a slice a different way. Bob, you asked the question from the how do these hardworking humanitarian organizations make a reach out to foundations. It's a journey. It's not any different than people who are working in climate change. They have to go on the hunt, and the Foundation Center is a wonderful example of where to find that. Plus, there are affinity groups that are across the country. I mean, we've got a marvelous representation to hear from Grantmakers Concerned with Immigrants and Refugees. So there are affinity groups that humanitarian organizations can find. But I actually want to shift the conversation to the value of CDP. And I know I kind of sound like a commercial, but we totally, the Patterson Foundation totally is committed to CDP because of the approach that you use by creating expert panels around whatever the disaster is. And those panels have a network so that a philanthropic dollar will be effectively spent. And I would venture to say, whatever slice of the global refugee work that CDP is working on, you already know the humanitarian organizations that you would recommend to a funder, through your consulting and services. So I think CDP's, there's a lot of daisies out there, and you can help through one daisy, but we really need to do the entire field. And that's why this collaboration, sharing information, sharing data is just so very important. And I want to go on just a little bit more, because echoing what Ann said about the role of governments and the humanitarian organizations, it's how we work better together, not how we stay in our swim lane, all right? And so it's how you stay in your swim lane, be really good at what you do, but then who else is in the race with you? And how can you leverage your impact together? And I think CDP spends their time figuring out how to bring together the best knowledge out there.
Thank you, Deborah, for those words. Aryah, how do you handle this issue with your organization, Grantmakers Concerned with Immigrants and Refugees, because you're dealing with so many different funders, but also so many different nonprofit organizations?
So, we really are very open if there are organizations in the field who want to share their work with us. That happens quite frequently, that organizations do reach out to us and say, I'd like to share this idea that we've developed or some of the work, a recent report. And I think that's, of course, extremely helpful to us. That will sometimes lead us to do a phone call to learn more in depth about how that particular organization or movement is doing their work. So I think we, as Deborah mentioned, are always very open, and our doors are open to organizations to share information with us. And, in terms of our members, our membership is all foundations. And we also have philanthropic advisors and philanthropy serving organizations who partner with us, like CDP and the Council on Foundations. And I think just reiterating and kind of picking up the thread from Deborah, I think there are places where there's great leverage and opportunity. And I think there are ways for us to work together, as mentioned through the CDP fund or in other ways through other collaborative networks that are being developed right now in the sort of rapid response time to really focus grant making to address where the needs really are in the field. And that can happen in the global context. There are those that are working in that space, and we're more focused on the domestic. And I think we're really interested in getting more philanthropic engagement in these areas that I mentioned, and in other ways with respect to refugees in our communities right now, and also, the understanding of the global refugee crisis. And, we are interested in doing more programming. We're interested in pulling strategy calls together. We are very open to really trying to move this forward to address a lot of the critical needs we've raised on the call.
Thank you, Aryah. Ann, I want to ask you another question that came in from a listener. And this is, again, in the area of policy, and it's a little hypothetical, but what should we expect in terms of the refugee crisis if the current outline of the U.S. ban stays in place? What does that mean to the overall effort? What's the role, I guess, how does the U.S. fit into the bigger picture? And so what would that mean to the refugee crisis?
Well, I think the big change will be the U.S. will take fewer refugees and be less of a model for other countries. So there will still be a need to help refugees arriving in the United States. If there's a pause and then there's a resumption, one hopes if there were a pause that there'd be a resumption, although it's not clear that there would be. But there'd be a resumption, then the Trump administration proposal is to bring 50,000 refugees per year. And so they would still need help in getting resettled and restarting their lives, establishing themselves. Kids would need tutoring. Adults would need help getting jobs and learning or perfecting their English. One important thing then would be to try to, working internationally, keep other countries to keep them receiving refugees and volunteering to take them and expanding their programs too. So I think that's harder to do without the U.S. in the lead, but we've seen in other areas sometimes when the U.S. stops something, other countries will try to fill in the gap. And so what's just so heartbreaking about this is that the U.S. was head and shoulders the leader above other countries. And so a lot of refugees look to the U.S. for a new start in life.
So there was an email from someone on this issue who asked, what advice would you have for those who are poised and ready to be part of the welcoming movement? We're looking for a way, should we be looking for ways to reinvent ourselves or lead others to join us? I guess they're wanting to know, will there be resettlement offices in the United States, and will there still be a role for volunteers?
This is Ann. I think the answer is yes. But I also think, in addition to helping the refugees, I think that people who are paying attention now and becoming activists can also be advocates to try to build back up the program. This is a very important point, the beginning of the Trump administration. It's an important point to let members of Congress know, state governors, as Aryah said earlier, local and town officials, how you feel if you're in support of giving a fraction of the world's refugees a new start in the United States. I'm also very concerned that in describing refugees and immigrants, the president only talks about them as people who are a threat, either because they're criminals or they're a burden, when we know that refugees and immigrants can revitalize American cities and can make major contributions to our lives, our economy, if given a chance.
Aryah, I want to spend just a moment on the domestic issues around immigrants and refugees. We hear sometimes that the number of individuals coming from Mexico and from Latin America has slowed down. Is that how you see it? And does that mean that there's fewer people that need our help?
Well, I think, thinking about, I think Anne also referenced this, the Central American crisis, where we have seen the flight of migrants and refugees into Mexico and the United States. That flow still continues. I don't have the numbers today, but those numbers are continuing, whereas a lot of the immigration from Mexico has diminished, but that's a trend that's been in place for some years. And I think, the policy for those that are arriving at our border seeking asylum has been quite challenging. And, there's still a question about whether and what will happen to those that seek asylum at our borders under the new administration. So I'm not sure that we necessarily want to think about it as either or in terms of policy and support. I think our refugee communities have supported and aligned with those that are concerned about asylum seekers arriving at the border, seeking protection, and to ensure that they have access to proper asylum procedures. So there is some coalition and definitely agreement on that. And so I don't know that that's necessarily the greatest concern. I think, and in fact, we're seeing across communities locally that refugee leaders, as I mentioned, there's a great program run out of Church World Service for local organizers that do work in North Carolina and Texas, for example, where they've really built some coalitions across different issues and working with the immigrant rights community and understanding each other's issues. And so I really think it's a moment of coalition building, of movement building, really taking time to understand each other's concerns and issues. And I think that's something that's being supported by philanthropy and can be supported even more. So I think I'd frame it that way based on our experience.
Well, we've only got a few minutes left, and I want to give each of you a chance for a closing statement. And I'd like you to think a little bit in your statement about what you see as the next few weeks and months to be the situation with the refugee crisis. What should we be thinking about in the next few months? And then also, how can a donor get involved and make a difference? And Debra, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Aryah, and then Anne will ask you to wrap it up. So Debra, what's your thoughts about your final recommendations to donors who may be listening today?
Okay, thank heavens you allow me to focus on donors, because as a muggle again, I think foreseeing what's in the near future would be out of my realm. I'll defer that to the wizards. But over on what a donor can do, I think it's time for every human being, whether human, philanthropist, foundation, to just pause and understand, learn about the situation. This has been a great time together on the phone, on this webinar, but I sit here and go, oh, I didn't know that, I didn't know that. It'll help me think. We need to understand that we are all part of a globe, and what can we as individuals do, realizing that any one person can't do it, but when we combine our intellect, our values, our resources, then we can have an impact. And I'm again going to say, whether it's through the Grantmakers Concerned with Immigrants and Refugees, whether it's through CDP, the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, whether it's through the Council of Foundations, come together with some other people so that you can leverage whatever assets you want to put into this conversation. We just will be able to make a difference if each one of us are educated, engaged, and excited about the opportunity.
Thank
and
you.
that would be a period at the end of that sentence.
Okay, all right, thank you. Aryah, some final thoughts from you?
Sure, of course. I think that we have been fairly clear about this, but I just want to reiterate that, you know, it is indeed a complex policy space, and we recognize that. And I think Deborah has really highlighted just that opportunity for learning. And I think that we need to really think about the resiliencies of this community, the opportunities that are presented for public-private partnerships, for cross-sector engagement. You know, we're really seeing organizations and philanthropy from across the spectrum really coming together to try to learn about these issues and to take action. And it happens at a national level. It's also happening at a local level. So, you know, definitely take a look at your community, convene spaces for dialogue, create safe spaces for learning. You know, look into some of these more innovative ideas about how to build up our refugee integration system, how to support policy and advocacy, how to build refugee leadership. These are all things that are happening in our local communities. And there are ways to support it. As Anne said, a little money can go a long way. And there are great opportunities right now. And I really encourage everyone to step forward, connect with one another, reach out to us, reach out to the Council and Foundation, reach out to the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, reach out to Debra, you know, reach out and connect with one another. And I think we will be able to really make some great progress in this space.
Thanks, Aryah. Anne, a few last thoughts from you?
Yeah, I guess in the coming months, personally, I'm going to be trying to get the word out to the public through journalists and public speaking that refugees are families. They're innocent people. They're ordinary civilians. They're not terrorists. They're oftentimes the victim of terrorist groups. And I think that's sort of been lost by some of the political leaders in this country who equate them with a danger to Americans. In terms of how can a donor make a difference, I guess I hope in this phone call we've convinced you that you can make a difference. You can definitely make a difference. The question becomes, what is the best fit for you, your foundation, your philanthropy? Is it advocacy or legal aid, domestic focus, or overseas, or both? Healthcare, education, or even just helping NGOs operate better during a time of stress and strain. There's plenty of opportunity to help. The needs are real. And I think it becomes really more of a question about fit, where you're most interested in making a contribution, because I'm convinced you can make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to our three panelists, Aryah Summers Landsberger, and Richard and Deborah Jacobs. Thanks so much for your time and your expertise. Thanks to Stacy Fraser and the Council on Foundation for sponsoring this event along with CDP. And if you have questions about the Center for Disaster Philanthropy's global refugee crisis, you can write to us at the email address found on here or call us at 206-972-0187. Thanks so much for your time and interest today. Have a great afternoon.